Today you'll hear the story of a man whose name split the world into admirers and opponents, into those who trusted his promise of justice and those who feared the shadow of utopia. This is the story of Karl Marx, philosopher, economist, perpetual exile, and a thinker who wanted not only to interpret reality, but to remake it. We'll trace his childhood in the German city of Trier, follow him into exile and poverty in London, and show how Friedrich Engels became his closest ally, partner, and lifeline to the very end. You'll see how Marx's central ideas took shape, how capital was forged, and what fed his imagination in philosophy, economics, and politics. We'll also examine how a theory became an ideology that reshaped the 20th century, from workers' circles to revolutions and coups, how Marxism traveled to Russia, China, and Cuba, and why it still grips minds today. And finally, we'll talk about Marx's legacy. Was he a prophet of a new world or a dangerous dreamer? Why do his arguments sound newly sharp in an age of crises, inequality, and social upheaval? Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Sleep stories appear here every day. Trier, Youth, and the Road into Philosophy. On May 5, 1818, in ancient Trier, a town set in the Moselle Valley and still marked by its Roman past, a boy named Karl was born on Brückergasse. No one could have guessed that this child's name would become a symbol not only in philosophy, but in the history of ideas that reordered societies and shook empires. Trier was a place where ruins, monasteries, and provincial Prussian routines coexisted under the long shadow of history. Marx grew up in an educated Jewish family. His father, Heinrich Marx, was a lawyer with Enlightenment sympathies. He admired Kant, read widely, and respected intellectual freedom, yet understood how harshly the Prussian state limited opportunity. When Jewish lawyers were barred from practice, Heinrich formally converted to Lutheranism, less an inner transformation than a practical decision forced by the rules of the time. From childhood, Karl lived in an atmosphere of quiet contradiction, official conformity on the surface, private independence of mind at home. His mother, Henrietta, came from a prosperous Amsterdam Jewish family and mostly spoke Dutch and French. Less academic than her husband, she was nonetheless strong-willed, practical, and determined that her children should be educated. Karl, the third of 9, stood out early. According to family recollections, he read eagerly, argued intensely, and tried not merely to absorb books, but to wrestle them into his own interpretations. Even as a teenager, he debated his father about politics and morality with unusual confidence. He attended Trier's Gymnasium, one of the best in the region. A liberal-minded director promoted humanist ideals and encouraged broad learning. There, Marx discovered classical languages, ancient history, and the first real pull of philosophy. His school essays already strained beyond the curriculum. Themes like the tension between faith and reason foreshadowed the inner battles he would later wage as a thinker. After graduating with distinction, he entered the University of Bonn at his father's urging, preparing for a legal career. But student life distracted him. Literary clubs, debating circles, and the romantic intoxication of youth. His discipline slipped, his parents worried. To rein him in, Heinrich transferred him to the more rigorous University of Berlin. Berlin changed everything. There, Marx encountered Hegel's philosophy, still dominating the intellectual landscape even after Hegel's death. The Hegelian school had split, conservative interpreters loyal to the state, and the young Hegelians, radicals who turned dialectical critique against religion, monarchy, and inherited dogma. Marx gravitated quickly toward the radicals. Figures such as Bruno Bauer and Ludwig Feuerbach sharpened his skepticism. Bauer's biblical criticism and Feuerbach's claim that God reflects human essence helped Marx break with religious thinking and convinced him that philosophy must touch the ground of real life, not hover in pure abstraction. In 1837, he wrote a long confessional letter to his father describing an intellectual crisis. Poetry and romantic illusions no longer satisfied him. Words alone, he admitted, could not change the world. He wanted to understand how society actually functioned, why some command while others obey, and what it would take to alter that structure. Though he remained formally enrolled in law, his true focus became philosophy and political economy. His doctoral dissertation, defended through the University of Jena, examined ancient materialist philosophers, Democritus and Epicurus, through questions of necessity and freedom. On the surface, it was a theoretical work, yet even there Marx's instinct was historical. Ideas mattered because they were born within human life and social conditions. Afterward, he returned to Cologne and entered journalism, where theory would collide with censorship and power. Journalism and exile, the collision with reality. Marx did not seek an academic post in Prussia. His reputation was already suspicious to authorities, and prospects were slim. In Cologne, he joined a new liberal newspaper, the Rheinische Zeitung, funded by Rhineland industrialists and jurists hoping for reforms within constitutional monarchy. Marx began as a contributor and quickly emerged as one of its most forceful voices, combining sharp logic with an ability to make complex arguments understandable. By late 1842, he effectively became editor-in-chief. His writing alarmed censors because it aimed past individual abuses and towards structural injustice. One notorious series targeted the wood theft laws that restricted peasants from collecting fallen branches in aristocratic forests, an old practice that poor families relied on to survive. Marx argued that a law presented as neutral was, in fact, a weapon aimed downward, protecting property at the expense of life. It was an early glimpse of his later themes: class power, the role of law, and the masking of interest behind legality. He also attacked censorship, church-state entanglement, and the moral language used to justify political control. In Berlin, officials demanded the paper soften its line. Marx refused. He left the editorial post, and in March 1843, the government shut the paper down outright. The lesson hit hard. Under monarchy and censorship, truth could not live freely, even with a public platform. Critique alone, he began to think, was powerless without deeper political transformation. That autumn, Marx left Prussia. He moved to Paris with his wife, Jenny von Westphalen, an educated woman from a noble family who chose him despite the loss of comfort and status. Paris was Europe's furnace of political argument. Socialists, Republicans, anarchists, and exiles debated in cafes and reading rooms. Marx entered the scene, but he remained wary of French utopians who sketched harmonious futures without explaining the machinery of the present. He wanted causes, not blueprints. In Paris, he wrote the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, exploring labor under capitalism and introducing a concept that would define much of his early thought: alienation, how a worker can become separated from the product of their labor, from the act of work itself, from other people, and from the sense of being fully human. Alongside Arnold Rouge, he launched the German-French Annals, meant to combine German philosophical depth with French political urgency. Only one issue appeared, but it included Marx's influential critique of Hegel's political philosophy, where his opium of the people line appears in context: religion as both an expression of suffering and a consolation, and therefore something that cannot be abolished by argument alone, without addressing the misery that produces it. Paris, however, was not safe. Under Prussian pressure, French authorities expelled him in early 1845. It was the first of many forced departures.
He moved to Brussels, where police oversight was lighter, and where a partnership began that would define the rest of his intellectual life.
Engels and the beginning of a great alliance. In late August 1844, a young Friedrich Engels arrived in Paris. He was 24, the son of a factory owner, yet already a fierce critic of industrial capitalism. Marx had met him briefly before and was initially dismissive, but Engels had changed, so had Marx. Engels had recently lived in England and witnessed the working-class world of Manchester: cramped housing, brutal hours, exhausted families, children growing up inside smoke and hunger. He observed, recorded, and analyzed rather than moralized. Those notes became the foundation of the condition of the working class in England. When Marx read Engels' materials, he recognized something crucial: an analysis rooted in real economic life, not dreams or sermons. Their conversations in Paris stretched for days. In the National Library, they studied Smith, Ricardo, Say, and the core texts of political economy. At night, they argued about how to fuse German philosophy with the hard facts of industrial society. Out of this came the earliest shape of historical materialism, the view that social life and history are driven primarily by material conditions, production, property relations, and class struggle, rather than by ideas floating above society. One of their first joint works, The Holy Family, attacked the abstract idealism of certain young Hegelians and insisted that serious critique must begin with labor, property, and real human circumstances. Supporters hailed it as a new approach. Opponents accused them of abandoning high philosophy for crude materialism. For Marx and Engels, it was neither a fad nor a pose, it was a commitment. Political pressure followed them. After further crackdowns, Marx was expelled again, this time from France. He chose Brussels. Engels, not compelled to leave, went with him anyway, one of the first major personal sacrifices in a friendship that would become both intellectual and financial.
Manifesto and Revolution: The Brief Season of Hope. Brussels offered Marx a rare stretch of relative calm. He and Engels connected with circles of German workers and exiles across Brussels, London, and Paris. They engaged with the League of the Just, a secret society shaped by early utopian socialism and moral slogans like "All men are brothers." Marx and Engels did not despise the League's members, but argued that goodwill without theory was fragile. Without clarity about classes, ownership, and the economic base of society, revolution would falter. They founded a communist correspondence committee to build intellectual coordination across cities. The League eventually reorganized as the Communist League and adopted the new slogan, "Workers of all countries, unite." At a later Congress, Marx and Engels were tasked with writing a programmatic text. That assignment became the Communist Manifesto. Published in February 1848, it opened with its famous spectral image and offered a sweeping argument: class struggle drives history. The bourgeoisie revolutionized production, but also created its own gravedigger, the proletariat. The text criticized rival socialist currents and insisted its aim was not to invent a perfect future, but to expose the real laws of capitalist development. Then came the revolutions of 1848. Monarchies shook, constitutions were demanded, barricades rose across Europe. Marx returned to journalism, founding a new paper in Cologne that became a radical democratic voice. But the revolutionary wave met swift counterattack. Uprisings were crushed, concessions reversed, and reaction regained ground. Marx was expelled once more. Paris turned hostile under new repression. With options closing, he moved to London, where exile became permanent.
London: poverty, loss, and the long work of capital. London, center of the British Empire, was also a city of stark contrasts: wealth built on global trade and factory expansion, and poverty packed into damp, crowded streets. Marx arrived without stable status, income, or security. The family settled in Soho at 28 Dean Street, an address later remembered as the site of some of their hardest years. The apartment was cold and cramped. Money vanished quickly. Often there wasn't enough for coal, candles, or medicine. Jenny managed the household, copied manuscripts, mended clothing, and held the family together. Their main lifeline was Engels, who worked in Manchester and regularly sent financial support. Marx hated having to ask, but survival left little pride intact. There were moments so bleak he wrote of pawning his last pair of trousers or lacking food and fuel. Tragedy struck repeatedly. Between the early 1850s and 1860s, the family lost 3 children. The death of Edgar, whom Marx called Mush, hit especially hard and silenced him for a time. Yet even then he returned to work, day after day, in the reading room of the British Museum, surrounded by books and government reports. He studied statistics, factory investigations, trade figures, banking documents, and the canon of political economy in multiple languages. He was trying to uncover the laws of motion of capitalism. In these years, he drafted Grundrisse, a vast set of notebooks that laid out categories: commodity, value, wages, capital, circulation, without yet forming a finished structure. He also wrote for the New York Tribune for years, analyzing international politics and economic crises, sometimes under Engels's name, sometimes anonymously. The pay helped, but poverty remained. His health deteriorated: painful skin conditions, migraines, insomnia, and chronic exhaustion. He still worked obsessively, revising endlessly because he feared error, believing that a movement built on false theory would fail. Finally, in 1867, after almost 2 decades of preparation, Volume 1 of Capital appeared in Hamburg in a print run of 1,000 copies. Early reviews were cautious, too dense, too difficult. Yet in workers' circles it quickly became a foundational text, a systematic critique of capitalist production. Behind the author's name stood unseen sacrifices: Jenny's labor, Engels's money, years of cold rooms, and children lost to sickness and deprivation.
The First International: Unity, Conflict, and the Limits of Cooperation. On September 28, 1864, representatives of workers' organizations from several European countries gathered in London and founded the International Workersmen's Association, later known as the First International. Marx did not launch it, but he soon became its central theorist and drafter of key documents: statutes, manifestos, and public addresses. He deliberately avoided overly technical language to keep the coalition broad. But unity was fragile. A major split emerged between Marx's view, building centralized political organization to fight for power, and the anarchist wing, led by Mikhail Bakunin, who rejected the state entirely and warned that centralized structures would reproduce oppression. The dispute became ideological and personal, and after the Paris Commune of 1871, the conflict intensified. Marx defended the Commune as a heroic experiment in workers' self-government. Opponents interpreted it differently. Eventually, Bakunin and allies were expelled, sparking a deeper rupture. The International weakened and was formally dissolved in 1876, but it left a lasting lesson. International solidarity was possible, but hard, always threatened by strategy, temperament, and competing visions of freedom. Capital: The Anatomy of a System. Capital was not written as a pamphlet or a quick response to events. Marx wanted to expose capitalism's inner structure, the logic that makes exploitation possible even when exchange appears fair.
He begins with the commodity, society's basic unit of wealth, showing how it contains both use value and exchange value. He moves through money and circulation toward the central mechanism, surplus value. The worker, he argues, sells not labor itself, but labor power, the capacity to work. In a working day, labor power can create more value than it costs to reproduce, wages. The gap between what workers are paid and what their labor produces is surplus value, captured by capital. Marx distinguishes absolute surplus value, longer hours, and relative surplus value, higher productivity. He supports the analysis with factory reports, medical investigations, and parliamentary documents. One of the most famous sections, Primitive Accumulation, narrates capitalism's birth through force, enclosure of common lands, displacement of peasants, colonial plunder and slavery. Against the myth of natural property, Marx describes a violent history behind modern wealth. He planned more volumes, but illness and loss slowed him. After his death, Engels edited and published the later volumes from Marx's drafts, a task that took years and demanded deep understanding of his method. Family life behind the public figure. Behind the image of the revolutionary stood a man shaped by love, grief, and family devotion. Jenny von Westphalen chose exile and hardship over comfort. Of their 7 children, only 3 daughters survived into adulthood: Jenny, the younger, Laura, and Eleanor. The household lived amid books, debates, and constant financial anxiety. Jenny copied manuscripts and managed debts. She was, as Marx often implied, his anchor. Marx was affectionate with his daughters, reading Shakespeare, exchanging jokes, and writing tender letters. Friends described him as capable of booming laughter and lively conversation, despite his public severity. The house was chaotic, papers and books everywhere. Only Jenny, the daughters joked, could find anything within it. Engels remained a constant presence, not only in ideas, but in practical rescue: money for rent, food, and even, at one grim moment, funds needed for a child's funeral. Such humiliations left marks that never faded. Final years: loss, illness, and death. In the 1880s, Marx's world narrowed. In December 1881, Jenny died after a painful illness. Marx wrote of emptiness, as if part of himself had been removed. Soon after, their eldest daughter, Jenny Longuet, died as well, a second blow that broke what remained of his resilience. Doctors urged warmer climates. Marx traveled south, briefly to Cannes and then to Algiers, his only journey to Africa. He noted the sun and the unfamiliar architecture, but the letters carried loneliness. He returned to London weaker than before. Eleanor cared for him. Engels visited constantly. On March 13, 1883, Marx died quietly in his chair, as if asleep, surrounded by papers and books. He was 64. The funeral at Highgate Cemetery was modest. Engels spoke a short eulogy, comparing Marx's discovery of historical laws to Darwin's in Nature, and closed with a conviction that proved true: the name and the work would outlive them. After Marx, how ideas become history. After Marx's death, Engels organized and published the unfinished volumes of Capital and preserved his friend's intellectual legacy. Meanwhile, Marx's ideas spread through Europe's socialist parties and worker movements, turning theoretical vocabulary, class struggle, exploitation, surplus value, into political language. In the 20th century, Marxism moved beyond Europe, reshaped by local conditions and revolutionary leaders. In Russia, it became state ideology after 1917, later formalized as Marxism-Leninism, often simplified or bent to serve power. Elsewhere, China, Vietnam, Cuba, parts of Latin America and Africa, Marx's ideas were adapted as tools against colonialism and inequality, with each country producing its own version.
Criticism grew alongside influence. Some accused Marxism of determinism or rigidity. Others blamed the crimes of regimes that invoked his name. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, dogmatic Marxism lost prestige. Yet in the 21st century, interest returned, less as a state doctrine than as a lens for analyzing crises, inequality, and the dynamics of modern capitalism. The 2008 financial crash, among other shocks, pushed many readers back toward capital as an uncomfortable but provocative map of systemic instability. Karl Marx did not leave a simple recipe. He left questions that refused to die, about labor and value, power and ownership, freedom and justice. Whether praised or condemned, he remains one of the thinkers who forced the modern world to argue with itself, and keep arguing.